Hello, my name is Chard deNiord, and welcome to Poets Speak, Conversations with a Vermont Poet Laureate. I'm happy to welcome Jeff Friedman today. Jeff is the author of 7 books of poetry, most recently Floating Tales, which will be published this fall by Plume and Mad Hat Press. 6 of his other books have been published by Carnegie Mellon Press, books such as Pretenders, Working in Flower, Black Threads, Taking Down the Angel, Scattering the Ashes, and his first book, The Record-Breaking Heat Wave, which was published by the University of Missouri, Kansas City in 1986. His poems have appeared in such journals as the New England Review, the Antioch Review, the New Republic, Missouri Review, Agni, and many, many others. He's won numerous awards, including National Endowment for the Arts, a Literature Translation Fellowship, which was awarded to both Jeff and his co-translators, Vinnie Orlovsky, the Milton Dorfman Poetry Prize, the Missouri Review Editors Prize, and 2 individual artist grants from the New Hampshire State Arts Council. He is here today to talk about his poetry, as well as the poems as he's translated from the Hebrew and the Polish, and just to also, in general, talk about his muse, which is wonderfully diverse and powerful and funny and poignant. So welcome, Jeff Friedman.
Thank you for having me on the show. I'm looking forward to this. And thanks to Roland, who's so nice and good. So I'll start with a poem that sort of represents my past. I came from St. Louis originally. I was born in Chicago. I came from St. Louis. And my father was a salesman. And this poem is called Two Salesmen. And it was at a time when I was really concerned with capturing spirit of place and trying to maybe capture things as what I saw them to be. Also looking at what it means to make it in America. So the 2 salesmen, my father and my uncle. Work hard, my Uncle Harold says, and you'll get somewhere, boy. And my father nods his head of black curly hair. With drinks cradled in their hands, they sit side by side on 2 throne-shaped swivel chairs, staring at the small black screen set in the tan console. Carved wood doors pinned back against blonde wood. Harold sips the scotch slowly, but my father drinks it down, then rattles the ice in his glass. I sit on the carpet in front of them, playing solitaire, Vegas style, while they repeat the same stories. How Galvani made a fortune in Houston, how Klein's went under because of bad management, how Shaloff declared bankruptcy, but not before he put away a pretty penny for himself. I lost a 25,000 piece order, my father says, because Henry couldn't ship it on time. That's crazy. Harold's clipped, thick mustache tickles his long, hawkish nose whenever he smiles or laughs. He can make a quarter disappear from his hands and pull it out from behind my ear. He could shuffle a deck in one hand and turn over an ace of spades anytime he wants to. I tell him I've gone out twice in a row. Amazing, he says. But my father looks down at me with his tired eyes. Quit cheating. Play it right. Outside, the wind tears at the trees, and fading red and gold, the leaves tumble in a shower of leaves. And one more fall passes. The wasps curl in their white paper house, shaped like a large, beautiful shell, and the cedar bushes bunch together like broccoli. In fall, my father died in a car accident, practically penniless, and my uncle went to sleep forever in a hotel room, hundreds of miles from home, staring at a picture of the sea and 3 white gulls frozen on the shore. Work hard, Harold says, and my father nods his assent, cracking the ice between his teeth. While I cheat at solitaire, pulling a card from the bottom of the deck when I need it to keep my run going. The swivel chairs squeak and groan as my father and uncle lean together and whisper their plans to make it big. Then they toast each other and touch the empty glasses to their lips.
Thank you. You started out as actually a fiction writer, and you became, I think, very influenced by Philip Levine's poetry, who's also enjoys writing a lot of narrative poetry throughout his whole career, actually. What prompted you to shift from fiction writing to poetry back, I think, in your days at the University of Missouri?
Well, I had, actually, you're right. I was on my way to wanting to write novels and writing very long maybe 25-page short stories. And I went there to work with some of the fiction writers. And there along the way, I met Larry Levis, and I think I was taking myself a little too seriously as a fiction writer at the time, because everything sort of had to come out like Chekhov or like Isaac Babel. It had to be, it had to be like really serious. And all of a sudden I met Larry, and I started going to see him regularly. He was on sabbatical, and he was so generous, and I started writing poems. And I just started to enjoy the play of language and the way I found ways to tell stories in poem form. I was also working in an orderly in a nursing home, night graveyard shift. And so I was having trouble, writing long short stories and going to school at the same time. So I began to put them in poem form. And that's really where it began,
Yeah. Now, I think a lot of people wonder, how do poets survive? Yeah, you've held many jobs since you graduated from the University of Iowa MFA program. And we're obviously writing the whole time, pretty furiously, actually. Could you just talk about how you balanced your work life with your writing, and what some of the things that you did for jobs?
Well, okay, so growing up, I worked in the garment district in St. Louis, factories and warehouses. My father was a salesman and got me those jobs. Then as I moved on, I had a job at the GRE testing service for a while. And then I worked in St. Paul, I worked in a job called the Governor's Crime Control Commission through environmental design. And then I worked at a Minneapolis welding rod, so I did that for a while, like the 3 o'clock to 11 at night shift. And then I worked for companies in New York, like editing, copy editing. I think the way I survived as a writer, first of all, I'm an insomniac, as you know, and I'm up a lot. So I don't get that much sleep most of the time. And, I don't know if I weren't able to be up at 4 or 5 in the morning working a job, like when I got a job in New York, a full-time job in New York, you had to get there by, you had to sort of leave the house by 7:30 or 8. And if I didn't actually have that, the ability to sort of get up and be working or work early, very early in the morning, I may have had trouble. Although I do have to say I stole some time on the job, at every job I ever had, to work on poems. It didn't matter whether it was like, all of a sudden I'd be like going this and going, wait a minute, I just got a good idea. I'll just scribble it down, so those two things.
When did you start teaching? And how long have you been doing that?
Well, I started teaching at Iowa. I got a fellowship to go there. Well, no, I started at Missouri, actually. I was teaching composition there, and then I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop with a fellowship, and I taught poetry there. And then I did a little teaching after that. I taught a little bit at University of Missouri St. Louis and a little bit at Washington U. I think I had a class there that I taught. And mostly like adjunct. That wasn't full-time teaching, while I was doing other things. And then we moved to New York. My wife and I moved to New York because she got into a program that she wanted to go to there. And then that's really difficult because it makes you you can't get a teaching job there. I did a little tutoring on the side, but really I ended up getting jobs editing or in publishing, doing that kind of stuff. So when my wife and I had an agreement that the first person who got a good teaching job, we'd take it. Of course, when I made that agreement, I thought it was going to be me. And then she got a job at Dartmouth. So I was hesitant to move, but then I ended up moving back, and I decided when I came back here, I wanted to get back into teaching. Yeah. So. Yeah. So much of your work is biblical in many ways. Could you talk about your muse, which is often a Jewish muse, but at the same time, this very universal muse that crosses over? Well, I grew up, I wasn't tremendously religious or, didn't go to, or any of that. I mean, but I grew up with those stories from the Bible. I mean, my mother, I remember I had a comic book, an Old Testament, the Tanakh comic book, I shouldn't say that. And my mother used to read me the stories from Genesis particularly, which I'm really much more focused on than I am in other parts of it. But, one of the things I went to really early on was retelling those stories because I knew them so well at one point. So I did a lot of retelling of stories, But I think, when I read Two Salesmen, it represented a way of speaking to an audience, telling stories, like trying to get to my family as a representative family. But I found myself, when I moved here, after time, going on these long walks and being much more isolated and sort of having a new audience, instead of talking to my friends every day, like I did in New York and going to movies all the time and seeing them, I started talking to the crows and the bears that hung around. They became my new audience to talk to. And I think that moved me into fable and a whole new set of, and a more village tale teller kind of idea, representational tale teller. Yeah. In my stories. But the Jewish humor never went out of it. Like, for example, Kafka, as Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found he'd been transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. Like, that's a wonderful opening, and then the whole idea of him with his little spindly legs and in bed trying to get up and hold on to his humanity, and then his mother being outside going, "Let me in, Gregor, I love you no matter what, I love you no matter what," and finally, he gets the door open somehow with those legs, and she looks at him and faints, which I find to be tremendously funny and tremendously Jewish, at the same time. So I think I love that,
Yeah. So I would love you to read a poem, your Shamai poem, if you don't mind. I've got it right here if you need to find it. And then maybe to follow that up with your bear poem, because that provides a really nice arc between those more kind of coherent early poems that you wrote, and not so early, you've written them up until fairly recently, and your new poems, which are prose poems essentially, that delve into very surreal territory.
Right, yeah. So my Shamai refers to a scholar who lived around the time of Hillel, who was probably more by the book, more like extensively that way. And to my mind, my Shamai refers to a number of Jewish men I knew, Jewish rabbis, Jewish men, teachers and scholars who were, brilliant and crazy at the same time. You know what I mean? So that kind of demanding, and also could change in a dime, change on a second on you. You know what I mean? Like, get me some water. I didn't want water, that kind of thing. So it refers to that. Anyway, my Shamai. My Shamai curses when I stutter through my Havtorah. You call that Hebrew, he says, and walks to the back of the synagogue. Recite again. My Shamai mocks me when I mispronounce Leah. You say it like the Goyim. He commands me to lie on the roof and stare through the skylight. What do you see? Rabbi Fishman and Rabbi Nodell discussing Torah. You see nothing, he replies. My Shamai glowers like a star, his death a flame for eternity. He shakes in the wind, his hands trembling with the diseases he calls fear of God. Dust clings to his hair. He buys me a new shirt and tie. Comb your hair, he commands. My Shamai is filled with truth, like an eclair bloated with custard. He prophesies the fall of empires. He corrects me as though I were a dog on a leash, but there is no treat. My Shamai opens another carton of milk and blesses it. My Shamai gives up 1,000 lives as he paces behind my book. He won't ever say yes because nothing is perfect. He believes the end is coming, and soon after, the void to end all voids. My Shamai cracks 3 eggs on the bowl and scrambles the yolk and curses earth for all she has taken. He praises truth because it is without hope. My Shamai stares into the mirror like a lost patriarch, flinches at his own wizened face. He rails and rails, but I can only listen and help him back to his chair.
In the last year or two, maybe it's been 2 years, you've written much more kind of surrealistic poems.
And I began, I think, writing these short stories that found their way into these fables. They became shorter. And I remember when I first started thinking about sending them out, my friends would look at them and kind of go, they're not long enough, develop them. And somewhere along the line, I realized I didn't want them to be longer,
Yeah.
So this one, Bear Fight, is interesting because we have so many bears in our neighborhood, and I'm always telling you stories about the bears and being up in the trees, and also because it's like one of those stories about, the typical trio. You love somebody, and she says to you, basically, you don't know who I am, and you really don't know who she is, and she loves somebody else who says to her, you don't know what you're getting yourself into. So it's sort of about that kind of triad, and the new work I've gotten into, as I said, deals with the idea of transformation and metamorphosis. So, and it has been. So, Bear Fight. When Liza fell in with the bear, I was more than disappointed, as I had been in love with her since childhood. What's he got that I don't? I asked as we walked past the diner together. He's a bear, she said. She let go of my hand. He gets a little jealous when I'm out with my friends. Why do you want to be with a bear anyway? Two teenagers pushed past us with their skateboards. Balloons floated above Main Street, announcing a sale at the furniture shop. Why do you want to be with me, she asked. We parted ways when the light changed, but later I went to her home dressed as a bear. She opened the door. Come in, she said, putting her arms around me. You don't smell like a bear, she said. Then in walked the bear with a fierce look on his face. He growled, and so did I. He cuffed me, so I cuffed him back. Then we grappled with each other, bear hugging, until Liza stepped in between us and held out her hands. I'm sick of bears, she said. Get out of here. I ripped off my bear mask. I'm not a bear, I said. The bear ripped off his. I quit this game, he said. I'm not a bear either. Liza removed her mask, and she wasn't Liza. We ran away as fast as we could. I made it back to my place and locked the door, turning on the outside light, but all night I heard her huffing.
That's wonderful. So these are sort of like fables for adults.
Yeah, fables.
That you're writing, and I can tell that you're really enjoying writing them. And,
yeah.
And
I do, and I sort of think of Woody Allen and Mel Brooks when I'm writing them also, you know what I mean? Like the whole idea, like ripping off the mask and, coming up with,
right.
Right,
they seem to have opened up just like a whole new kind of territory for you in a way.
I think they've allowed me to talk in a way I wasn't talking before.
Right. Now, the whole time that you've been writing, or you've also, almost the whole time, you've also been editing, especially in the last 5 or 10 years. You've edited this book with, as I mentioned in the introduction, Zvinia Orlovsky, which won an NEA for translation, and is a very important book as far as the poetry that it brings back again to us in 2017 about the Holocaust. Yastrun was Jewish, but he survived the Holocaust. So could you talk a little bit about these poems and why you undertook this project?
Well, Zvinia and I had wanted to do something together for one thing, and then I really actually started looking for something to do, and I wanted to have the Bible involved with it in some way. I wanted a Jewish writer. And it was very strange because we began to look for something, and I think I was talking to my up-the-block neighbor, and he might have made the suggestion. And I had read Yastrun in Miłosz's anthology a long time before.
So that's why Miłosz, who won the Nobel Prize.
Yeah, and I'd read it in this post-war Polish anthology. And so I came back to it, and I thought, well, this is actually kind of somebody who might be interesting. And then, my family, my mother's side of my family comes from the Galician region, that has now been split up between the Ukraine and Poland. And it turns out he was from that region, which I didn't know at all to begin with, but when I got into it, I found out. And Zvinia has family that came from there. So really, it sort of threw us back.
We should mention that Zvinia is also a poet. And,
she's a poet and translator in Ukrainian.
And fluent in Polish. Yeah. And so, and Ukrainian, of course. And so was just almost waiting for you to approach her about this.
Yeah, I mean, we've been good friends for a long time, so it kind of fell into place. I mean, her job was to kind of take it from the Polish and move it into English, and then I was supposed to, I would turn it into the poetry, and then we'd go over it together again. Yeah. That was our working process.
Could you just say something fairly succinctly about the poetry itself, the poems that you chose, and why you think these poems are so enduring?
Well, I think, Yastrun to me was a guy who really wanted to write nature poetry, and was with a little bit of a mystical tendency, which related to me. You know what I mean? That mystical side of him. But along came the Holocaust and the occupation, and it sort of it colored or it contextualized all of his work writing about nature and everything else. In other words, all the poems became about what was going on at that particular time, who was betraying whom, and what was actually happening. It all became some way of talking about this, and at the same time talking about nature. And there are these references, like in Knife with Red Shaft, where it's obviously based on the Isaac Abraham story with the sacrifice, but it just hints at it. It just hints at it at the end, and he sort of works it in brilliantly.
You want to read one?
Yeah, I think I will, but I don't think I'll read that one. I think I'll read Silence, because I think it's a beautiful poem, and this whole idea of everything around you disappearing appears in it. Silence. A darkness closer than darkness of night. If there is no longer a listener, even among stones, when only one ear exists, then the handset receives no phone signal. On the seashore, beaten white foam, the recorded cries of the seagull. Glass tile hits an iron crowbar, splatters to the stars. House, who has forsaken companions, disappears in smoke. The cup extinguishes the drinker.
Yeah, and just a few words about this book too, which is Two Gardens, Modern Hebrew Poems of the Bible, which you've also translated. This, which just came out, actually, right?
Yeah, I mean, I did that book. I was a distinguished writer in residence at University of Missouri back in 2003. At the time, Howard Schwartz and Nati Zohar, the three of us would meet every Saturday, and we got on the idea of translating poems together. And Howard he's an expert on, Midrashic texts and Jewish fable and myth. He would like sort of give us the backdrop all the time, and Nati would do the, Nati was born in Israel, and Nati would do the text in Hebrew, right. And I would again convert it into the poetry, and then we discuss it. And over time, actually, the book we worked fairly quickly. It took about 3 years to finish the book, and a press in Indiana accepted it for publication, and then they ran out of money or something, or it was the permissions was an issue. Yeah. And so they didn't end up publishing it. So it sat for a long time until recently we were contacted by a publisher who wanted to do it.
Yeah. So just mention a few of the poets in there. I think it's important for people to
Yehuda Amihai is in here, Don Pagis, the wonderful Yona Wallach, who's, I don't want to compare, I mean, I'll say Sylvia Plath because her images have that kind of wild expressionistic quality, but she's not really like her. Dalia Ravakovich, there's Natan Zak, I'm just thinking Miriam Rivka, and Shlomo Wiener, Yocheved Bat Miriam, and T. Carmi, who did a lot of anthologies. Howard Schwartz did the big Voices of the Ark anthology from a long time ago, and then T. Carmi did the other big Hebrew anthology that came out in the 70s or 80s, So they were both known for that. Barak Aseri, who was more on the Palestinian side. Yeah. So, this, I mean, actually, I guess it follows up a little bit on the, Natan Zak has a wonderful poem. Don Pagis is a wonderful poet who lived through the Holocaust, and I like his poems a lot. I mean, everybody in here I liked, actually, but, for some reason he appealed to me quite a bit.
Could you talk maybe a little about...
These are all from Genesis, by the way.
All from Genesis. About these new floating tales that you've written, and this book that's coming out called Floating Tales in the fall. And maybe just read one or two of those poems, but also just, again, talk a little bit about why the prose poem now, as opposed to verse poetry, is so enticing to you, and why you find the prose poem, that form, more conducive to what you're writing as far as these fables.
Well, I think I started with it really to kind of doing litanies, like repeating structures, almost like a regular poem, but just not breaking into lines. Mm-hmm. And that sort of met my storytelling conditional other. And I mentioned to you a quotation from Calvino's book, Six Memos from the Millennium, in which he has a section on lightness, and he talks about giving up the weight, the solidity to see another reality. Yeah. And he mentioned shamans who much go up into the air, or Kafka stories where the bucket rider, where he flies in the air to come back to another reality or to see it. And if so transformation is involved in this. And I felt that was something that I was transforming as a human being. When I'd go back to St. Louis to, for example, read, I was so priding myself early on in capturing the exactitude of the spirit of place, and I realized that none of those places were the same as I saw them, so I was actually writing about a mythic St. Louis, and I was becoming a myth maker in myself. I could fool people on the East Coast because they didn't know anything about St. Louis, but I go back to St. Louis and everybody knew about these things. And they go, that ain't the same now. What are you writing about? You know, so I started getting away from the idea of, I started getting into the idea of mixing realities. You know, my regular reality with a dream reality, with a surrealism, sort of moving things back and forth and allowing anything to happen that might happen. And these pieces played a part in this because I would start with a line that usually had something to do with, like in the bear fight where he falls in love with a bear, something that kind of moved out of the typical line of reality, almost like what Emily did, tell the truth but tell it slant, to try to get some other slant on the way I was seeing things. And having given up this idea of writing, using myself as the funnel by which all other visions come through, but kind of going to the village storyteller, the village teller, the representative self, the larger representative self.
Yeah. So they in a way it sounds like are very archetypal.
Yeah, more so. Yeah.
In many ways. Yeah.
Right.
Do you want to read one just as an example?
Yeah. Let me. I'll tell you what. I'll read the first one in the collection, which is which might be considered a love poem of sorts, or something out of the ordinary, or something's happening out there. It's called White Feather. After Alexandra kissed me, a white feather flew out of my mouth. I pretended that nothing out of the ordinary had happened, though the feather floated between us for a long while before it fell on the carpet. The feather was long and bowed with soft fringe. I wanted to pick it up and twirl it, but Alexandra seemed concerned. Did you eat a white bird, she asked. I shook my head. It's only one feather, I answered. She eyed me suspiciously, though a moment before, she had seemed perfectly happy to be kissing me. To prove that there was no problem, I kissed her, and everything was fine. Our lips met, our tongues touched and tangled, as they had 1,000 times before. Then another feather floated from my mouth and stuck in her thick black hair. She pulled it out and scrutinized the feather for a long time. There's something inside you trying to get out, she said. You have to do something about it. What can I do? I said. It's only 2 feathers. She picked up her journal and began writing. Now I was alarmed. Had I done something to deserve this? Had a bird flown into my mouth in a dream? I thought about my dreams, but couldn't remember anything particular. Let's try one more kiss, I said. But this time, a white dove flung itself from my mouth, flying wildly around the room until it hit the window and fell on the floor. Is it dead? I asked. She kneeled and cradled the dove in her arms. Then she carried it outside, I thought to bury it, but instead she threw it in air. The dove caught itself before plummeting into the pavement and landed on a branch above us. We'll figure this out, she said, squeezing my hand, but I could already feel a tickling in my throat as the dove began singing.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. Well, I was wondering if you could end maybe reading your poem. I think it's called Good Sense. Do you know that poem?
Good Sense.
Sense. I think it's in Pretenders. Yeah.
Oh,
here it is. Right? It's called Good Sense.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good sense, if there is any logic or sense in it. Davin comes from divine, and what's more divine than a lovely divan on rollers, a real holy roller? If you get on the backside of a donkey, you'll learn to bray. Never paddle in a puddle, or pedal your paddle in a river, or split hairs over a fallen petal. Let the seeds fly into the bad man's eyes. Let flax or flux drift down over the black tuxes. Weed out the liars at the wedding, and don't marry anyone with bad dishes. Obviously, Davin means to pray. And
that's right.
And this was a Vermont, New Hampshire poem.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Well, thanks, Jeff. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful talking to you.
Thank you. It was great talking to everyone.
Thank you.
And being here.